Welcome. We're back, and this month we are continuing our On the Road series. We're at University of Michigan Flint, and for the first time, I have two guests, not one, and they're both here today to talk a little bit about the changes to the K-4 social studies standards as part of our current year update. So I'm joined today by Dr. Annie Whitlock from University of Michigan Flint and Stan Masters from Lenawee ISD. Good morning, guys.
Good morning,
Good morning.
Dave.
And I know Stan in particular served through a large portion of the process on the K-4 updates. So we are looking forward to really digging into what changed. So if you don't mind, I'll jump right in. One of the things I noticed is between the 2007 standards and the 2019 standards is that there weren't a huge number of changes in K-4. The number didn't grow or shrink substantially. So why don't you guys fill us in a little bit on what happened, what exactly happened with K-4 social studies?
Well, I think that's a good point to communicate, is that we had very few changes in the scope of the years within the elementary social studies area, K through 4. Sequence didn't really change. But what we tried to do with the changes was to make those standards really include people from all across Michigan. So that as you look at these in 2020, there's a way for everyone to be represented in those standards. So very few changes that you'll see, and we would like you to make sure that you take a look at that side-by-side document that's found on our website to take a look at the small amount of changes that took place.
I like to think of the changes as more of enhancements, and I think one of the biggest enhancements we made was the inclusion of examples on each of the standards, both in content and instruction. The examples are not meant to be prescriptive at all. In fact, we encourage teachers to look at a standard and maybe think of their own examples that they could add right directly to the document. But yeah, like Stan mentioned, a few standards were eliminated, but others were expanded to make them easier to assess. So in the end, I don't think it resulted in a change in the actual number of standards.
I agree with you that the inclusion of those examples within the expectations will be very helpful for elementary teachers whose plates are filled right now with English language arts and mathematics and science and social studies. So having those examples available so that you can see which ones would work best with your students, I think is going to be very helpful.
Well, while we're on the subject of those examples, there was a pretty substantial K-12 terminology shift that sort of begins in the K-4 grade bands. We moved away from the terminology American Indians and have moved towards using the terminology Indigenous Peoples. What can you guys tell us about that shift and what it means both for K-4 and kind of the entire document?
Well, we thank, again, the representatives from various tribes within Michigan that were able to be a part of the revision process and to help us understand that we need to send the message that as we study Indigenous people, we not only just look at the past, but also the present. Because again, those people have a rich history, rich culture, and that exists today.
Yeah, we wanted to make sure we were representing their culture accurately and not, as like Stan mentioned, a past culture that has disappeared. And so we were very happy to have some of the tribes from the state of Michigan actually involved in the standards revision process. So it's bigger than just changing the terminology from American Indians to Indigenous people. They really were able to give us that Indigenous perspective that we used to revise some of the K-4 standards. And I think a biggest one is like an inclusion of tribal governments and recognizing that as a form of government that is used in our state.
I think that the examples that we learned, that we included in the document, will bring more richness to opportunities throughout the state to know a little bit more. And maybe, again, spike the curiosity of our learners to know, oh, there is a level of government that's different than what maybe we've studied before or what we have in our area.
And this is important in third grade standards. They do learn about the history of Indigenous people in Michigan, but then also in fourth grade when they're learning about the current state of our state government and our state culture, that they are also included.
Okay. There are some great connections between the arc of inquiry that's in the C3 framework and some of the literacy practices that are taking place in particularly elementary classrooms around the state. What does good social studies classroom instruction look like in K2 or K4?
That's a great question. I think it's important to note that inquiry can be done with young children. I think that's a really basic statement, but I think a lot of elementary teachers know this, but maybe we need to get the word out to others as well that yes, young children can be engaged in inquiry. They love to ask questions. Children are naturally curious, and teaching social studies through inquiry taps into their strengths and their desire to learn more about the world around them. So elementary students are really prime to learn about social studies. But unfortunately, we're living in a time when social studies in the early elementary grades especially is not emphasized in classrooms. And even if an elementary teacher is really passionate about social studies, sometimes there are mandates on instructional time that are simply out of your control, and you have to teach social studies in a 20-minute block a day. So we're trying to, with the standards as well and our professional development that may be coming up later, to think about how we can infuse social studies into other parts of the elementary school day.
You know, as the elementary teachers embrace the essential practices, it's important to realize that we really need to make sure we're teaching subjects like science and social studies to help with background knowledge and vocabulary, with strategies for reading different texts. So I'm excited that as you take a look at the standards and as you utilize the C3 framework, that there's opportunities to use the practices that you are using in your classroom around English language arts and mathematics and apply those also in the subjects of science and social studies. I think that, again, tying back to what you mentioned about the curiosity, helping the students scaffold those types of questions so that if you start out with the questions that you generate, eventually, again, you can start building opportunities for your students to ask those questions and to formulate them into those compelling and supporting questions that are necessary in the arc of inquiry.
Yeah, and social studies is a place where you practice your literacy skills. And I would say science is the same way, and other disciplines, it's where you practice those literacy skills, those disciplinary literacy skills as well. So there's sometimes a misconception that elementary students need to master literacy skills before they can do social studies, and that's simply not true. Those things can complement each other quite well.
It's going to help broaden your assessments around reading comprehension as well, because you'll be able to utilize the data that you're collecting around social studies inquiry and take a look at what is needed for those students in terms of, again, the background vocabulary, their background knowledge that they have, maybe some strategies in terms of reading trade books as opposed to other books. So it's going to be a great opportunity for you to take what you've been practicing around the essentials and infuse that right into social studies.
So while we're on the subject of inquiry, what does inquiry look like in a K-4 classroom? How do you guys envision teachers practicing it in the K-4 classroom?
I've been in a lot of K-4 classrooms, and I've seen inquiry done a lot of different ways with young children. So I don't think there is one particularly, like a particular prescribed method to teach inquiry. It's going to look really different in a kindergarten classroom as it would in a middle school or high school classroom. I think a good way to start teaching inquiry is simply to encourage questions. Encourage your students to ask questions. Really record them, actually write them down on chart paper, keep a running list of things that we're curious about in the classroom, and then model for your students how you find the answers to those questions or how those questions lead to more questions, and simply modeling that process for them is really important.
The foundation, again, of the C3 framework is around those particular questions. So as you start your day with them, maybe in that morning breakfast time or as you're taking attendance, hey, having those students, again, to start think about questions that they're wondering about, because those wonderments can lead to really important ways to help mold them into the framework, the spine of the C3 around the compelling and supportive questions. And again, social studies in the elementary needs to be one in which is more authentic. And so having them identify the types of tasks, the things that they would like to perform to show evidence of their learning, again, that's foundational. And then finally getting into the source material where they can answer those supportive questions, that they can read about different people, different places, different times, will be the foundation for what you do in inquiry. And again, as you've learned in your other subject areas, scaffold it. It may start out with you being the center, maybe again eventually allowing your practices around learning centers to grow so that students are engaged and leaving behind some of the trails that they're learning for their other students as well, to a point where maybe somewhere along the line there'll be an opportunity for them to start with their own personal inquiry and go through the arc of inquiry to get to the answer that they not only want to have answer to, but they want to do something about that.
If you're looking for a really good resource to guide kindergarten through fourth grade students through a more social studies directed inquiry, you can start by looking at the Michigan Open Book Project. So these are a series of free digital textbooks that are structured with the arc of inquiry. And yes, they are textbooks that go all the way down to kindergarten, believe it or not. The kindergarten and first grade books are meant to be big book style textbooks and read out loud, possibly to students that can't read independently on their own quite yet. But every chapter is a compelling question in these books, and each section of each chapter is a supporting question that leads into it. And then throughout the text of the books, there are interactive activities and interactive tasks and assessments and sources built right into the books to help also guide those compelling and supporting questions. So that's a really great way to start teaching. If you're wanting to get those resources, we know resources for elementary social studies are few and far between, so this is a really good one. So if you Google Michigan Open Book Project, you can have access to all of the books, K through 12. But a textbook by itself is not going to be enough to teach inquiry. So the Michigan Open Book Project is simply just a resource. I would agree with Stan that really asking your students, talking to your students about what they want to learn more about and using the standards as a guide. In second grade, for example, there's the local community is the focus for the social studies standards in that grade. So start by asking the students what they want to know about the town or the city that they live in and use their input to guide which standards you choose to take on in that particular time.
Yeah. Make it fun. Again, as they're learning and so forth, and they want to think like a historian, maybe have some hats that they're going to put on when they're thinking like a historian. Or again, if they want to go places, have a variety of table maps and globes available so they can see the different parts of the world. Certainly integrate the technology, with the media that they use, interactions with other places as well. We're really looking forward to partnerships that we will have with museums and local libraries to bring in, different aspects of history, geography, civics, and economics. Again, have fun with it so that when they get to that time in their schedule around social studies, they're really going to look forward to it, much like they're learning to look forward to reading and looking forward to learning more about science.
Well, guys, I want to thank you both for your time here today. Your contributions to furthering social studies in the state are not unnoticed, and they're very much appreciated. So I greatly want to thank both of you for taking time, and we will see you back here again next month for yet another deeper dive into something that's new with Michigan Social Studies Standards. Thank you.